September 24, 1991. A CD arrives at record stores across America with a cover so controversial that some chains refuse to stock it without censorship. The image: a naked baby swimming underwater, chasing a dollar bill on a fishhook. Inside is the second album from a three-piece band from Seattle that had been living on food stamps just months earlier. The record label expects to sell maybe 250,000 copies. Respectable numbers for an alternative band, the same modest success they'd achieved with Sonic Youth. The recording budget was $65,000. By industry standards in 1991, when Guns N' Roses was spending millions on their double album extravaganza, this was pocket change. Nobody, not the band, not the producer, not the label, had any idea what was about to happen. Within 6 months, Nevermind would knock Michael Jackson's Dangerous off the #1 spot on the Billboard 200. It would sell 300,000 copies per week at its peak. It would eventually move over 30 million copies worldwide, making it one of the best-selling albums of all time. More importantly, it would accidentally destroy an entire genre of music, redefine what rock could sound like, and turn three uncomfortable misfits into the reluctant spokesman for a generation that didn't want spokesmen. This is the story of how Nirvana's Nevermind changed everything, and how Kurt Cobain spent the rest of his short life wishing it hadn't. Welcome to the Sound Vault. Every album has a story. This is Nirvana's. To understand Nevermind, you have to understand what Seattle was in 1990. The city had been quietly incubating a sound for nearly a decade, a fusion of punk's raw aggression, metal's heavy riffs, and indie rock's authenticity. Bands like Soundgarden, Mudhoney, The Melvins, and Tad were creating music that was intentionally ugly, deliberately uncommercial, aggressively anti-establishment. At the center of this scene was a tiny independent label called Sub Pop, run by Bruce Pavitt and Jonathan Poneman. Sub Pop had mastered the art of regional hype, turning Seattle's grungy isolation into a marketable aesthetic. In 1989, Sub Pop released Nirvana's debut album Bleach, recorded for the legendary sum of $606 with producer Jack Endino at Reciprocal Recording in Seattle. The album was recorded in just 3 sessions spanning about 30 hours. Bleach was murky, sludgy, heavy. The sound of Black Sabbath filtered through punk nihilism. It sold modestly for an indie release, about 40,000 copies in its first year. Respectable but not revolutionary. But there was one exception on Bleach, a song called About a Girl. Producer Butch Vig, who would later produce Nevermind, remembers hearing Bleach for the first time. I was kind of unimpressed. I thought their record was kind of one-dimensional, but there was one song on there, About a Girl, which to me was a brilliant pop song and sounded like Lennon-McCartney-style songwriting. Kurt Cobain had written About a Girl as a love song to his girlfriend Tracy Miranda, heavily influenced by the Beatles. It was melodic, catchy, almost sweet, everything the grunge scene supposedly rejected. But Cobain had a secret. He loved pop music. He worshipped the Beatles. He studied the Pixies' loud, quiet, loud dynamics religiously. He wanted to write songs that were both aggressive and beautiful, angry and melodic, punk and pop. The problem was the Seattle scene demanded purity. Any hint of commercialism or melody was viewed as selling out. Cobain felt trapped between his pop instincts and the underground's rigid aesthetic rules. By late 1990, Nirvana had a bigger problem. Sub Pop was broke, unable to properly promote or distribute their music beyond the Pacific Northwest. The band was living in poverty. Cobain often slept in his car or on friends' couches in Olympia, Washington. He was frequently sick, battling undiagnosed stomach problems that left him in constant pain. They needed money, they needed a bigger platform, they needed to escape. The indie credibility versus mainstream success debate was about to explode. September 1990. Nirvana's drummer Chad Channing had left the band, citing creative differences and escalating tension with Cobain. Channing had played on Bleach and most of the early Nirvana recordings, but Cobain was growing increasingly frustrated. He wanted a drummer who could hit harder, play with more power, match the intensity of his vision. Cobain and bassist Chris Novoselic had been through multiple drummers. Dan Peters from Mudhoney filled in temporarily. They recorded Sliver, a perfect punk-pop single, with Peters in July 1990. But they needed someone permanent. Enter Dave Grohl. Grohl had been the drummer for Scream, a Washington, D.C. hardcore punk band with serious underground credibility. When Scream broke up mid-tour in Los Angeles, Grohl found himself stranded on the West Coast, broke and uncertain about his future. Buzz Osborne from the Melvins, a friend of both Cobain and Grohl, suggested that Nirvana needed a drummer. Grohl auditioned on September 25, 1990. The chemistry was immediate. Grohl hit the drums like he was trying to break through them. He had the power Cobain wanted, the precision Novoselic needed, and the punk credibility the Seattle scene demanded. More importantly, Grohl was a genuinely nice guy. Affable, enthusiastic, without the tortured complexity that Cobain carried. Krist Novoselic later recalled, "We knew in 2 minutes that he was the right drummer." With Grohl behind the kit, Nirvana suddenly became a different band. The songs had weight, momentum, explosive dynamics. The quiet, loud, quiet formula Cobain loved from the Pixies finally had the rhythmic foundation to work. But they were still on Sub Pop, still broke, still unable to tour extensively or reach a wider audience. Something had to change. April 2–6, 1990. Before Dave Grohl joined, before the major label deals, Nirvana traveled to Madison, Wisconsin to record demos at Smart Studios with producer Butch Vig. Sub Pop's Jonathan Poneman had recommended Vig after hearing his work with Killdozer. Poneman hyped the band aggressively. "These guys are going to be bigger than the Beatles." Vig remembers Nirvana arriving at his modest studio still featuring Chad Channing on drums. From the start, Cobain remained fairly quiet, letting Krist Novoselic do most of the talking. "Krist asked me about a lot of punk records, asked if I could get this or that kind of sound," Vig recalls. "They didn't want too clean or trebly. They wanted to sound real heavy." Vig laid sheets of plywood across the studio floor to enhance the live sound of the room. For the most part, the band used their own equipment, except for a Fender Bassman that Vig got Cobain to use on In Bloom and Lithium. The session captured 8 songs. Breed, then called Imodium, In Bloom, Lithium, Polly, Stay Away, then called Pay to Play, and a Velvet Underground cover, Here She Comes Now. But the session was tense. Vig found Cobain's demeanor disconcerting. Kurt was charming and witty, but he would go through these mood swings. He would be totally engaged, then all of a sudden a light switch would go off, and he'd go sit in the corner and completely disappear into himself. I didn't really know how to deal with that. Engineer Doug Olson noticed the friction between Cobain and Channing. There was definitely something going on between him and Kurt, where Kurt was not psyched about something. Several times Kurt actually got over on the drums and tried to show Chad what to do. There was some definite tension. Olson recalls the Lithium session as being a very down day for Cobain. Kurt was in a very sour mood. He just made everyone miserable. Despite the tension, magic happened. The Polly recording from Smart Studios was so raw and perfect that it would end up on Nevermind unchanged. Recorded late at night, just Kurt and Krist playing live, with overdubbed vocals and Chad's cymbal crashes added last. After the session, something unexpected happened. Nirvana made cassette copies of the Smart Studios recordings and started shopping them to major labels, without telling Sub Pop. Jack Endino, who had produced Bleach, recalls, "They had actually made up these demo tapes. They gave me the tape and it said Nirvana on it with this little handmade cover. There were 6 or 7 songs, plus they had put Love Buzz on the end of it, and they were calling it a demo." Krist said, "Don't tell Sub Pop I gave this to you, but this is what we're sending out to try to get a deal." The Smart Studios demos became Nirvana's calling card to the major label world, and several labels came calling. By late 1990, multiple major labels wanted Nirvana. Columbia, Charisma, MCA, all were interested. The band ultimately chose DGC Records, an imprint of Geffen Records, based on one crucial recommendation, Kim Gordon of Sonic Youth. Sonic Youth had successfully navigated the indie to major transition just a year earlier, signing to DGC and releasing Goo while maintaining their artistic credibility. Gordon personally vouched for DGC, assuring Nirvana they wouldn't be pressured to compromise their sound. When Nirvana was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2014, Novoselic thanked their manager John Silva during his speech for introducing them to the music industry properly. On April 30, 1991, Kurt Cobain, Krist Novoselic, and Dave Grohl signed a 52-page recording contract with the David Geffen Company. The signing bonus was modest by major label standards, but to 3 guys who'd been surviving on food stamps, it was life-changing. The Seattle scene reacted with predictable outrage. Signing to a major label was the ultimate sellout. Sub Pop fans felt betrayed. The underground rumor mill went into overdrive. Nirvana had sold out. They'd be forced to make commercial radio rock. They'd lose everything that made them special. Cobain felt the pressure acutely. He desperately wanted commercial success. He'd grown up poor and was tired of struggling. But he also craved the approval of the punk scene that had nurtured him. This internal conflict would haunt him for the rest of his life. Late April 1991, Nirvana journeyed to Los Angeles to begin recording their major label debut at Sound City Studios in Van Nuys, California. Sound City was a legendary facility with a massive Neve 828 console that had been used by Fleetwood Mac, Tom Petty, and countless other rock legends. But it was also funky and affordable by LA standards, perfect for a band that wanted to sound huge without losing their raw edge. It was Nirvana's decision to work with Butch Vig again. Krist Novoselic explained, "It was such a great experience working with him in Madison. The label wanted us to work with other people, but it was kinda intimidating, and we were comfortable with Butch. DGC had suggested big-name producers like Scott Litt, R.E.M., Don Dixon, and David Briggs, Neil Young. Nirvana rejected all of them. They wanted Vig, who understood their vision." Vig remembers the week before flying to LA. Kurt sent a cassette which was done on a boombox. It was really terrible sounding. You could barely make out anything, but I could hear the start to Smells Like Teen Spirit, and I knew it was amazing. The band had rented an apartment complex in Los Angeles during the recording. Vig describes the chaos. They were living in this apartment complex, and it was chaos. There'd be graffiti on the walls, and the couches were upside down. They'd stay up every night and go down to Venice Beach until 6 in the morning. I'd go into the studio at noon, and they'd wander in around 4. Despite the chaotic lifestyle, the recording went remarkably smoothly. The band was tight, focused, confident. Dave Grohl's drumming was a revelation. Powerful, precise, explosive. Vig had brought engineer Doug Olson from Smart Studios to assist. They worked quickly, capturing most songs in just a few takes. Cobain didn't like doing multiple takes. His voice would get hoarse, and he felt spontaneity was lost with overthinking. But there was one exception. Something in the way. No matter how subtly the band tried to play the song, it came out too aggressive. Kurt walked into the control room and said it just had to sound like this, Vig recalls. He was barely whispering and playing the guitar so quietly you could barely hear it. It was mesmerizing. I pulled a couple of mics in, and we built the whole song around it. The recording was so delicate that Cobain couldn't be in the same room as Grohl's drums. The volume would bleed into his vocal mic. The song's atmosphere was fragile, haunting, unlike anything else on the album. Another battle emerged during mixing. Kurt kept trying to bury his voice, says Vig. I kept arguing, you can't do that. Your vocal performance is as intense as the drums and the bass and the guitar. Cobain wanted his lyrics obscured, hidden in the mix. He was self-conscious about his voice and uncomfortable with the idea of people focusing on his words. Vig kept pushing back, insisting the vocals needed to be prominent. Vig eventually won the argument during recording, but his mixes didn't make it onto the final album. The band and label decided to hire an outside mixer for the final sound. They brought in Andy Wallace, who'd worked with Slayer and Run DMC, a guy who understood both metal and hip-hop production. Wallace took Vig's recordings and gave Nevermind its incredible sonic sheen, crystal clear, punchy, radio-ready. The guitars were huge, the drums sounded like cannons. Cobain's vocals cut through everything. It was perfect, and Cobain hated it. Years later, talking about Smells Like Teen Spirit, Cobain told biographer Michael Azerrad, "It's such a perfect mixture of cleanliness and nice, candy-ass production. It may be extreme to some people who aren't used to it, but I think it's kind of lame myself." The album Cobain wanted was raw, muddy, like an old record scratching. The album Andy Wallace delivered was polished, commercial, accessible. It would help Nevermind conquer the world, and Cobain would never forgive it. The story of Smells Like Teen Spirit, the song that would define a generation, begins with drunken graffiti and a deodorant brand. August 1990. Kurt Cobain and Kathleen Hanna, frontwoman of the Riot Grrrl band Bikini Kill, were hanging out after a night of drinking in Olympia, Washington. At some point, Hanna spray-painted a message on Cobain's apartment wall. Kurt smells like teen spirit. Hanna meant it literally. Cobain had been dating Toby Vale, the drummer of Bikini Kill, who frequently wore a deodorant brand called Teen Spirit. Hanna was saying Cobain smelled like his girlfriend's deodorant. But Cobain didn't know Teen Spirit was a deodorant. He thought Hanna was making a profound statement about teenage rebellion and revolutionary spirit. He found the phrase poetic, mysterious, loaded with meaning. Months later, when writing new songs for the DGC album, Cobain remembered that phrase. Smells Like Teen Spirit became the working title for a new song he was developing. The actual creation of the song happened in a rehearsal space. Cobain showed the band a riff he'd been working on, borrowed heavily from Boston's More Than a Feeling and the Pixies' dynamic shifts. Dave Grohl started playing a drum pattern inspired by disco beats. Krist Novoselic added a melodic bass line that moved independently of the guitar. The structure was simple: quiet verse, exploding chorus, repeat. But the execution was magical. Cobain's lyrics were intentionally nonsensical, cobbled together from phrases that sounded good but meant nothing specific. A mulatto, an albino, a mosquito, my libido. He later admitted the words were completely ridiculous and that he was trying to write the ultimate pop song using the Pixies formula. When they recorded it at Sound City, something clicked. Grohl's drumming was thunderous. Cobain's scream on Hello, Hello, Hello was primal. The song had an undeniable, inexplicable energy. Butch Vig remembers hearing that boombox demo before the sessions. I could hear the start to Smells Like Teen Spirit, and I knew it was amazing. But nobody, not the band, not Vig, not DGC Records, thought it would become the biggest rock song of the 1990s. It was just another track on the album. DGC decided to make it the first single, but expectations were modest. Maybe it would get some alternative rock radio play. Maybe MTV would show the video a few times late at night. Nobody predicted what happened next. While Nevermind was being mixed, the band needed an album cover. Cobain had a specific vision. Something provocative, uncommercial, slightly disturbing. He'd seen a documentary about underwater birth and became fascinated by the imagery of babies swimming. He sketched out an idea. A naked baby underwater, chasing a dollar bill on a fishhook. The symbolism was obvious. Innocence corrupted by capitalism, humanity's instinctual pursuit of money from birth. But it was also shocking and potentially controversial. Photographer Kirk Weddle was hired to shoot actual babies in a swimming pool. The baby who ended up on the cover was Spencer Eldon, just 4 months old. His parents were paid $200 for the session. When DGC executives saw the cover, they panicked. A naked baby? On an album cover. Walmart and other major retailers would refuse to stock it. The band might be accused of exploiting children. They suggested adding a sticker to cover the baby's genitals. Cobain responded with a counteroffer. He'd allow a sticker, but only if it read, "If you're offended by this, you must be a closet pedophile." The label backed down. The cover was released uncensored, though some retail chains did stock censored versions. The controversy helped. People talked about the album before hearing a single note. The image was striking, memorable, impossible to ignore. Perfect for MTV, which was becoming the most powerful force in music marketing. Years later, Spencer Eldon would have a complicated relationship with his accidental fame. In 2021, at age 30, he filed a lawsuit against Nirvana's surviving members and various record labels, claiming the image constituted child sexual exploitation. The lawsuit was dismissed in 2022 after multiple failed attempts to properly serve defendants. But in 1991, the cover was just another piece of an album nobody expected to succeed. September 24, 1991. Nevermind was released. Initial orders were modest. DGC pressed 46,000 copies. Decent for an alternative rock band, nothing spectacular. The label's internal projections estimated lifetime sales of maybe 250,000 copies, matching Sonic Youth's Goo. Smells Like Teen Spirit was sent to radio and MTV in early September, ahead of the album release. And then something extraordinary happened. MTV, which had become the most powerful tastemaker in music, started playing the Teen Spirit video, not just late at night on 120 Minutes, their alternative rock show, but during regular daytime rotation. The video was perfect for MTV. Directed by Samuel Bayer, it showed the band playing in a dark gymnasium, while apathetic teenagers milled around, occasionally moshing during the chorus. It was anarchic, energetic, slightly menacing, everything that MTV's glitzy pop videos were not. Kids started calling MTV requesting the video, then calling record stores requesting the album. Within weeks, Smells Like Teen Spirit was everywhere, on rock radio, on alternative stations, even crossing over to pop stations. The album's sales trajectory was unprecedented. In its first week, Nevermind sold 144,000 copies, triple DGC's projections. The second week, sales increased. The third week, they increased again. This wasn't normal. Albums typically sold the most copies in their first week, then declined. Nevermind kept growing. By November 1991, just 2 months after release, the album had gone gold, 500,000 copies sold. By December, it was platinum, 1 million copies. By January 1992, it was triple platinum, 3 million copies. And it was still accelerating. The moment that crystallized Nevermind's cultural impact came on January 11, 1992. That week, the album knocked Michael Jackson's Dangerous off the #1 spot on the Billboard 200. Michael Jackson, the king of pop, the biggest selling artist on the planet, armed with an album that had cost millions to produce and promote, was defeated by 3 guys from Seattle with a $65,000 album about teenage angst. The symbolism was perfect. The old guard was falling. A new generation had arrived. At its peak, Nevermind was selling 300,000 copies per week. Record stores couldn't keep it in stock. DGC frantically pressed more copies to meet demand. Dave Grohl later recalled the surreal experience. We'd be driving around LA, and Teen Spirit would be on 3 different radio stations at the same time. We thought it was some kind of mistake. The album's success completely blindsided everyone involved. Butch Vig admitted, "I thought it might sell 200,000 copies if we were lucky. When it exploded, I couldn't believe it. None of us could." While Nevermind conquered the charts, another phenomenon was occurring: the instant death of an entire musical genre. Just 1 year earlier, in 1990, rock music was dominated by hair metal. Guns N' Roses, Mötley Crüe, Poison, Warrant, Skid Row. Bands defined by big hair, spandex, guitar solos, and lyrics about partying and girls. Hair metal was aspirational fantasy music. The bands looked like rock stars, lived like rock stars, sang about rock star excess. Fans didn't relate to them. They wanted to be them. Nevermind represented the opposite. Nirvana wore thrift store flannel shirts and ripped jeans, not because it was a fashion statement, but because they were actually broke. Cobain's lyrics were about depression, alienation, and authenticity. The band rejected rockstar posturing entirely. When teenagers saw Kurt Cobain on MTV, they didn't see an unreachable fantasy. They saw someone who looked like them, felt like them, understood them. The shift was instant and brutal. By early 1992, hair metal bands couldn't give away records. Warrant's Cherry Pie went from platinum to bargain bin in months. Mötley Crüe's Dr. Feelgood era suddenly seemed ridiculous. MTV stopped playing hair metal videos entirely. Record labels scrambled to sign grunge bands. Every label wanted the next Nirvana. Seattle was flooded with A&R representatives. Bands like Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, and Alice in Chains, who'd been building audiences for years, suddenly had multi-million-dollar deals. The term grunge became a marketing category overnight, much to the disgust of the Seattle musicians who'd never wanted to be categorized or commercialized. Eddie Vedder of Pearl Jam later reflected, "They, Nirvana, invented a whole new way for people to identify with rock music. Kurt in particular made it okay not to be a quote-unquote rock star." But there was a cruel irony at the heart of Nevermind's success. The album's anti-commercial message was being used to sell millions of records. Kurt Cobain's rejection of fame had made him one of the most famous people on the planet. His authenticity had become a commodity. And he knew it. Success destroyed Kurt Cobain. Not immediately, not all at once. But slowly, steadily, the weight of Nevermind's unprecedented success crushed him. In the months after the album exploded, Cobain gave interviews expressing his discomfort. He told Rolling Stone, "I didn't want to become a rock star. I wanted to write good songs and have them heard by people who could relate to them." The punk rock scene, his community, his people, viewed him as a sellout. Friends from Olympia stopped talking to him. The underground press, which had championed Nirvana just a year earlier, now attacked them viciously. Cobain felt like a fraud. He'd wanted commercial success, had signed to a major label specifically to get it, but now that success felt like betrayal. Every time a frat boy sang along to Smells Like Teen Spirit, Cobain died a little inside. He started sabotaging performances. Nirvana's infamous 1992 Saturday Night Live performance featured Cobain deliberately singing off-key during Rape Me and destroying his guitar at the end. It was a middle finger to mainstream acceptance. The pressure intensified in 1992 when Cobain met Courtney Love, frontwoman of the band Hole. They married quickly, and Love became pregnant. The tabloid media, which had ignored Cobain when he was broke, now documented every aspect of his life. Vanity Fair published an article alleging that Love had used heroin while pregnant. An allegation based on misquoted interview statements. The article sparked an investigation by social services, and Cobain and Love temporarily lost custody of their daughter Frances Bean after her birth. Cobain's drug use, which had been sporadic and manageable, escalated dramatically. He later claimed he started using heroin regularly to cope with chronic stomach pain that doctors couldn't diagnose or treat. But friends suggested it was also an escape from fame, pressure, and internal conflict. In interviews, Cobain grew increasingly hostile to the music industry, to mainstream success, to the very fans who'd made Nevermind successful. He told Michael Azerrad, "I'd rather be dead than cool." By 1993's In Utero, Nirvana's follow-up to Nevermind, Cobain was deliberately trying to alienate the mainstream audience. The album was abrasive, raw, intentionally uncommercial. Producer Steve Albini was chosen specifically because his anti-commercial production aesthetic was the opposite of Andy Wallace's polished Nevermind sound. But even that didn't work. In Utero debuted at #1 on the Billboard 200. Cobain couldn't escape success no matter how hard he tried. Dave Grohl and Chris Novoselic watched helplessly as their friend spiraled. They'd achieved everything they dreamed of: wealth, fame, critical acclaim, musical respect. But for Cobain, those achievements felt like prison bars. On April 5, 1994, just 2.5 years after Nevermind knocked Michael Jackson off the charts, Kurt Cobain died by suicide at his home in Seattle. He was 27 years old. His suicide note ended with a quote from Neil Young: "It's better to burn out than to fade away." Nevermind sold over 30 million copies worldwide. It's been certified diamond by the RIAA, 10 million plus US sales. In 2004, the Library of Congress added it to the National Recording Registry, recognizing it as culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. Rolling Stone ranked it number 6 on their list of the 500 greatest albums of all time. But Nevermind's real impact wasn't about sales or critical acclaim. It was about what the album represented: a generational shift, a rejection of 80s excess, a validation of outsider culture, proof that authenticity could be commercially successful. The album opened doors for every alternative, indie, and punk-influenced band that came after. Without Nevermind, there's no Radiohead, no Green Day, no White Stripes, no entire wave of 90s and 2000s rock music. Butch Vig reflected, "That album changed music. It changed culture. Nothing was the same after Nevermind." But the album's success also revealed the fundamental contradiction of selling rebellion. How do you remain authentic when authenticity becomes your brand? How do you reject commercialism when your rejection is making millions of dollars? Kurt Cobain never solved that contradiction. And maybe it's unsolvable. Maybe. The baby on the Nevermind cover is still chasing that dollar bill on a fishhook, forever swimming, forever reaching, never quite grasping what he's after. Maybe that's the perfect metaphor for the album itself. Beautiful, impossible, eternally just out of reach. This has been the Sound Vault. Every album has a story, and some stories, like Nirvana's, change everything.